Welcome to AFI DOCS 2020, presented by AT&T. I'm Ken Jacobson, Senior Documentary Programmer at the festival. And first of all, I want to thank our supporters of the festival, our presenting sponsor, AT&T, as well as AFI members, and of course, you, our audience. We're here today with the filmmaker, the director, producer of White Noise, and very happy to be speaking with Daniel Lombroso, and I'll introduce Daniel in just a moment. Basically, this is a very special screening for us. It's the virtual world premiere of the film, and we're very happy to have been able to present that, and thanks to Daniel for that, and to the Atlantic. And also, just to note that the film will be screening throughout the rest of today, so please do share the news with everyone you know. Daniel Lombroso, who is the director of this film, he is a documentary filmmaker at the Atlantic. The grandson of two Holocaust survivors, Daniel explores the seductive power of extremism through visual journalism. He began covering the alt-right in 2016 and spent 3 years reporting on the racist movement. And White Noise is his feature film debut. So without further ado, congratulations and welcome to our Q&A, Daniel.
Thank you, Ken. I'm excited to be here.
Great. And I'm excited to have this conversation with you. The film, for those of you who've seen the film already, the subject matter is intense, and the access is pretty remarkable. And so I wanted to start by asking you, Daniel, how you came to this topic and to describe your multi-year journey of reporting on the alt-right, and then also how you settled on these three characters who are all quite interesting and controversial, but quite different as well from each other.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I was actually one of the first reporters in the country to cover the alt-right. I started covering the movement in, I believe, June of 2016. So it was about 6 months before Trump won the presidency and maybe 8 months before he took office. I was a few years out of school. I was already working as a reporter at the Atlantic, and I saw white nationalism and conspiracy bubbling up online on college campuses where I had just left. And even in the rhetoric of the Republican Party. All of these things seem completely normal now, but if you're able to go back to 2016, when Trump just started running, it was completely outside what was possible and normal in American political discourse. So for me, we just started with kind of a question of, who are these people? What do they believe and what are their motivations? The term alt-right was not used when I started this reporting. It existed, but in the fringes of, the internet. And Richard Spencer, who became my first character, was not a household name the way he is now. So, I was lucky enough to find this early. I brought it to my editor, Kasha, who's the head of Atlantic Studios, our video department. And she right away saw the urgency of the story. We brought it to Jeff Goldberg, our editor-in-chief, and he saw the urgency of the story. It began with a short documentary profile of Richard Spencer back before he was a household name, like I said. And some people might remember, it's actually in the film. I was the documentarian who caught the excerpt of a room full of people breaking out into Nazi salutes. It was sort of this crazy, iconic moment. I didn't expect it. It went viral and really broke news at the time because it showed what the alt-right was about, that it was fundamentally a white nationalist movement. And from there, it just evolved organically into a feature, and the Atlantic was amazing about giving me the space and institutional support to make it happen.
And how did you come to include Mike Cernovich and Lauren Southern in the film?
That's a good question. I think our goal, so when we did the development phase of the documentary Beyond the Short, I spent time with probably 15 people, 20 people. I've interviewed at this point probably a few hundred people on the right. We decided on those three because we didn't want to give a platform to someone who doesn't already have a platform. It was important for us to find those who were extremely effective extremists. I don't mean that as a value judgment, but they have influence. They have, audiences in the hundreds of thousands or millions. Cernovich has the ear of people in the White House. Lauren definitely has the ear of people in government in Europe. So I think the first point was just that they already have this tremendous amount of influence, and I want to understand and get to the core of it. And the other is that they're complex. I think Richard is a little bit more straightforward. If you watch the film, his motivations are a little bit more straightforward. He really, he's that hardcore, and he's an ideologue, and that's what he believes. Mike and Lauren have a lot of contradiction, and as a storyteller, I found that endlessly interesting and worth exploring.
And what was it like for you to be spending so much time around these folks and some of the other people we see in the film, and just being in these rooms, being in these spaces, being at these rallies? How did you kind of take that in and process what you were seeing? And I guess I would also add, did it feel important to you from a reportorial point of view? Did it feel like this is a moment in the history of this country that needs to be told?
That was our starting point, that this is an unprecedented moment. We haven't seen a wave of nationalism, especially ethno-nationalism, since World War II, and I'm very cautious to use comparisons between the two. So yeah, it was just this unprecedented moment, and being in those rooms, seeing these ideas being weaponized online, and amplified through social media, it just felt like these ideas that I had been reading about since I was a kid, and maybe we'll talk, you mentioned in the bio, 2 of my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. I understood kind of at a gut level that hatred exists and racism and anti-Semitism is everywhere. But, it wasn't, I didn't really believe it until, I didn't really understand how widespread it was until I was in those spaces. And that's why I felt like a film that's from the outside looking out, from the inside rather looking out, was so important. You have to be in those spaces to really understand the scale of this. But these are people who are well-funded, that have huge followings, virtual, and you see that in the comments in the film. Those are all real comments on live streams. But you also see it at events. Mike Cernovich throws a party in New York City. I'm with him. A venue cancels. In an hour, he's able to take out $20,000 cash and bring his 300 followers to a new place on the West Side Highway. So, being in the room was the whole thing. Everything is about proximity to the people in the movement, because you really have to feel. People won't. It feels fake until you're there and you can hear it and feel it. Yeah. And in terms of dealing with it personally,
yeah, I did want to ask about.
Go ahead.
Given your background, you are the grandson of Holocaust survivors. Did you describe the level of discomfort, and also just did you have to resist the urge, or did you resist the urge to say things from time to time? You're pretty much in the background in the film. We hear you a few times asking questions, but were there times when perhaps the camera wasn't rolling, or material that got left out of the film where it was, you were engaging with them about some of their, ideas?
Constantly. So I have, hundreds of hours of interviews with all of them. Most of it obviously doesn't make the film, and I am planning on doing some reporting beyond the film when it comes out for broad distribution. Yeah, it was definitely tough for me personally, as someone who's proudly Jewish. My dad is from Israel, and two of my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. One is from Nuremberg, is from Germany, and she left on what's called the Kinder Transport to England in 1939. And my other grandmother was born in Kielce, a small town in Poland near Auschwitz, actually. And she was in hiding during the whole war, and both lost most of their immediate family. And one of them is actually still alive, Nina Gottlieb. She's in the credits, and she watched the film and actually gave very constructive notes and has been a supporter. Yeah, I know, I think I love filmmaking and see myself as a filmmaker, but I tried to practice journalistic ethics as much as possible here. And, you know, there were moments where it served the story to push them. And that's when you hear me pushing them in the film. You know, Lauren is giving a platform to misogyny and sexism. And then when it starts to affect her, she's sort of baffled by it. And that seemed like an obvious place for me to push back. You know, Richard is the leader of a rally where a girl dies, and then he says, "Sorry, not my fault." That seemed like an obvious place for a question. So, you know, I think I was strategic. It wouldn't have served me. I wanted to understand their psychology. It wouldn't have served me well to be constantly fighting with them. So I found my moments, especially when they were on camera.
So you mentioned the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, which we're coming up on 3 years on that already. You know, obviously, I think in the course of your reporting, that's a seminal moment. There's sort of a before Charlottesville and an after Charlottesville, and also really for the, you know, I think, you know, for the history of this country and political discourse. You know, so talk a bit about how that changed things for your characters in the movie and may have altered the course of your filmmaking, if it did.
Yeah. Charlottesville is the decisive moment. I think it's two. One is what they call Hailgate, when Richard first threw the salute, and that led to a fracture between Mike and Richard that plays out sometimes to comedic effect in the film. Charlottesville was a disaster for the movement. It was a PR nightmare. The one silver lining for them was that President Trump was perceived to have supported them. So they took some comfort in that and used it and exploited it. But, you know, the film gets much more interesting, honestly, after Charlottesville, because you see they have they struggle to organize, they struggle to raise money. You know, Richard, especially, his story in the film is about a fall from grace. I mean, he starts in rooms full of hundreds of people, and then by the end, he's at a agricultural building where they keep horses, and there's 12 people in the stands, and then eventually he moves home with his mom. You know, they started hitting so much resistance after Charlottesville from everyone that it became next to impossible for them. And I think that's when you see their self-interest start to seep in. You know, they are committed to the first, in Act 1, they're the most committed ideologues possible. And then you start to see when the resistance builds up, you know, all of them are looking for ways out. Mike becomes basically a pill salesman, and he's kind of goes full circle and goes back to being like a self-help guru, giving workshops to men. Lauren, at the end, basically bails on the movement completely. And like I said, Richard's at home now. So it's tricky. I think at a personal level, it was an excuse for all of them to get out and to bail. It's tricky though, because we still have to be vigilant. Those ideas are still out there and are spreading, and a lot of young people are still being radicalized. So just because those three have fallen doesn't mean it's over necessarily.
I want to get to Lauren in a minute, because in some ways she's, you know, the most complex and interesting of the three. But as far as Richard goes, what's the update with him? I mean, in the film, he's, you know, back in Montana at his mom's house, and he's playing the piano, and he's kind of by himself. What has he lost all of his power, or what's the update on Richard and his so-called movement?
Yeah, Richard fell. You know, I think he was Richard coined the term alt-right in 2008. He was kind of like the intellectual forebearer of the movement. Maybe that's giving him too much credit, but he was seen as the vision. At this point, no one takes him seriously in the movement. He's totally isolated. He's never had a source of income. His think tank, the National Policy Institute, you know, received some donations, but he comes from a very wealthy family, and he's always leaned on that wealth. And now things have become more complicated. He can't fundraise, and he moved home. He really has a very small following. He live streams from his basement. He's on YouTube. He sometimes has a mustache, sometimes doesn't. He kind of grows it every few months. But the bottom's dropped out. I mean, max, you have maybe 2,000-3,000 people watching his streams now, when in the past he had many thousands, tens of thousands.
Mike.
doing no in-person events.
Okay.
He hasn't done an in-person event, I think, since Michigan State, which is in the film.
So he has just, nobody wants to touch him, and partly because he's just not interesting anymore because he doesn't have that following, and partly because he, I'm assuming the organizations that would be inviting him don't want to invite, trouble onto themselves as well.
Exactly. His name is more or less synonymous with David Duke at this point, and he can't escape that baggage.
Yeah. Let's talk about Mike for a second. He's of the three, to me, he seems the most to be just a pure opportunist, and so I'm not quite sure what to make of him, in that sense. And you can play the game of, does he really believe what he's saying, or is he just doing it to build up his followers and so on? So I guess maybe the more interesting question here that really does relate to all three is, in this, given the tools of social media that they and everyone has access to, what do you think are the implications for our politics and our society when opportunists like this, who gravitate towards right-wing causes, use those tools to build followings and make the most of these opportunities to, build themselves up and, spread racist messages?
Yeah, I think you captured it. That's a huge thread in the film, is that racism is a commodity and conspiracy is a commodity. And now with the tools of the internet, you can build a viral career on spreading misinformation. You see Mike do that really early with the sick Hillary meme that claims that Hillary had Parkinson's. People might remember that from the 2016 election. And that was so effective that it, went all the way through right-wing media to Fox News and to the White House. And Mike has a knack for that. He's a shapeshifter. He's always willing to figure out what he needs to do to stay relevant and make a buck. And I think you see that in the film pretty clearly. He's got morphing from being a men's rights guy to being a pseudo white nationalist to then backing away and then, selling supplements at the end. In terms of solutions, as a reporter, I'm careful not to offer those. I think the film really tries to observe and to capture who these people are. I think my value in the film is showing people what's happening. I think a lot of politically plugged in people might know Mike Cernovich, but when I've shown friends or parents or relatives, it's just stunning to them that someone at home with a smartphone can just completely shape discourse in this country. So my goal is to raise awareness more than anything. There are a lot of interesting conversations about what the social media giants should be doing, and I don't have a strong opinion either way there.
As we enter the 2020 election cycle and begin to head into a general election campaign, clearly the Trump campaign in 2016 utilized the alt-right and tools, social media tools to reach alt-right followers, to build a broader base of support for Trump. My question, and a lot of that took place in a sort of practicing the dark arts of digital campaigning, and now in 2020, the person who headed that digital campaign, Brad Parscale, is running the entirety of Trump's campaign. Yeah. So what have you seen, or what do you expect to see in the next few months in terms of linkages between the Trump campaign and the alt-right, utilizing some of the things we see in your movie, perhaps?
Yeah, they also have a lot more cash on hand this election cycle. They were a cash poor campaign last time and still did well. And this time they have tons of fundraising. I don't expect to see Richard, Mike, and Lauren out there as a cheerleader for Trump. I think when you get into Act 2 and Act 3 of the film, you see how burned out everyone is on a personal level. And I think that's just typical with political movements. You know, you break through, some of your ideas have influence, others don't. You know, I think Mike, to some extent, continues to be a champion for Trump. Richard kind of flirts with being anti-Trump for whatever reason. He might be trying to rebrand, and I don't know. And Lauren has just completely checked out. I asked her recently, and she said she couldn't care less. She finds it boring. She's not interested anymore. You know, this goes back to my earlier point that the ideas live on. And I think Trump showed that xenophobia works, that, you know, evoking fear of the other is effective. It's a tool. And the pandemic, I think, will only make that worse, to be honest. You know, travel bans are acceptable now. There's a lot of fear of China, obviously. You know, I expect him and his administration, people like Stephen Miller, people who have sympathies to these people, to just double down.
Talk to us a bit about Lauren and how, you know, you observed somebody who was going through an evolutionary process during the course of the film, and that has extended, I think, since the filming ended. But you know, some of it's in the film, some of it's not. So tell us a bit more about Lauren, if you could.
Yeah. So that Lauren is the most complex, I would agree. She was also extremely hard to get access to. I think there's a misconception that these figures just want to do journalism. They're all willing to give you a quote for a story because they have control. None of them are willing to do like an unvarnished all access thing. I mean, this was so hard. Lauren took close to a year to convince to participate. You know, I'd get her in the background of a scene here and there. Right around the Russia shoot, which is only a very small section of the film, she really committed. And then she started to open up when we're in Toronto with her, and when she receives the call from Gavin McInnes, which is a pretty formative moment in the film. And then on to France. You know, Lauren, I tried to, as a reporter, understand what she was going through without sympathizing. You know, I think it's a very delicate dance, and I did all I could to see what was happening and try to understand her point of view without being there to make her feel better or be there as a supporter. So I always would remind, like, Lauren, I just, you know, thank you for telling me this, but this is on the record and I'm a reporter. And she does have a habit of telling me things, and some of that does go beyond the film. So I can't say too specifically, but I am working with The Atlantic to do some journalism on Lauren that goes beyond the film, because there are so many questions. You know, more specifically speaking, the alt-right is a deeply misogynistic movement. One kind of revolting example is, you know, Cernovich ran a website and he had a headline, "When in doubt, whip it out," you know, and you see some of the headlines in the film, mm-hmm. You know, where you know, many of the men in the movement almost openly advocate for taking women and doing what they want with them. So I think, you know, Lauren was naive to a lot of that, and then started to understand it in a much more immediate way over time. So my goal was to watch her processing and reckon with her and ask her the tough questions and make sure that she wasn't just ignoring it. Your last part about like where she is now and all of that, you know, Lauren, you see the film ends finding out that she's having a mixed race kid. Her kid is now 6 months old, I think. She splits her time between Vancouver, where she's actually originally from. We don't go into it a ton in the film, and I can talk more about that if you want, her origin, and where her partner is from. Her partner works around the world, and she follows him around. You know, I don't think it's like quite the idyllic, they call it trad life, the traditional woman. I don't think it's quite the idyllic life that she expected. She's traveling everywhere. She's still on social media a little bit, on Instagram at least. But she has largely checked out of, you know, the alt-right game. She's not openly putting out videos advocating for white nationalism anymore.
What is she doing as a career?
Good question. She re-enrolled in school. So she, just real quick on Lauren's story, she's from British Columbia, a small town called Surrey, grew up in a town called Langley, which is very white. She went to university but dropped out after a year, and she actually now re-enrolled, I guess now virtually like everyone else, in her school, University of Fraser Valley, under her old professor, and she's studying philosophy, which is fitting. She claims that the questions that she was asking, maybe opportunistically or insincerely in the past on YouTube, that she can now ask in a deeper way in her philosophy class. So yeah, she's really taken to Catholic theology, like Aquinas and St. Augustine and people like that.
So we're just about out of time, but I wanted to give you a chance to say the last word. And just, is there is there one thing that you'd like to leave us with in terms of the film and that you want people to think about after finishing the film and talking to other people about what they've seen?
Yeah. I think this is it's the only inside document of this movement that exists. I was alone, more or less. A reporter from The Atlantic, Andrew Morantz, who's fantastic, was inside with me, but we were really the only two reporters that rode this out over 3 years. I see this in The Atlantic. Jeff Kasha, who worked on the project, see this as a really important historical document. This stuff and these ideas have huge scale. People need to take that seriously. And I think there's a tendency to feel like you can ignore this, that if we just look the other way, it will disappear. And history, and especially the history I grew up with, tells me that you can't do that. So, I just hope that people do engage with the film in a sincere way and really try to understand that this stuff is everywhere, even in places like New York City, where I live. I would actually say especially in liberal, well-educated places. It's the people that you least expect that hold these views. And most of the people I encountered were middle class, upper middle class, were educated or highly educated. So yeah, my hope is just that people engage with this sincerely and take it seriously.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Daniel, for being with us today, and congratulate you on the film, and urge our audience to please spread the word. White Noise is available for the rest of today for viewing at AFI DOCS, and we're really thrilled to have been able to present the virtual world premiere. It's an important film, and I'm just very thankful to you for doing this kind of reporting, and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Ken. I'm excited to be premiering with you guys.